So one of the questions that keeps coming up is, how does this apply into objective reality, all of these particular inner leanings? We often speak to that there is no external world, that this is an inside game. Yet what about this objective reality? And to speak to the bridge, or this place of transition, how do these things seem to apply in relationships and communication, work, and what seems to be a relationship with the external world? We don't want to overinvest in what we've always done, and that is this extreme of mind identification. But there are certain tools and certain aspects of things that we can utilize to basically peel away the layers and build that bridge across this chasm, so to speak, or essentially enter into a space of transition. We could look at meditation as an entirely internal practice with no external distraction. And we could look at mindfulness as a way to bring that off of the mat or out of the laboratory, so to speak, and start to apply it in what appears to be this objective external reality that we interact with at work and with relationships and with environment, so on and so forth. There's a lot to kind of cover here, but there is some practical aspects of what we can do to really start to pay attention to how these things arise, how perception and thought is obscuring reality, and also in relationship, how communication can work. So we're going to focus a little bit on the practical aspects of communication. And the thing that really starts to become clear is if we are responsible, and responsibility is best described as how we respond in the moment, what is the expression of the experience. We find that responsibility doesn't have anything to do with a past event or a future projection. Instead, responsibility is an ownership, an embracing, an acceptance of our current experience. It is still a present experience. In other words, responsibility and blame are eons apart. To take responsibility is essentially to own an experience or to completely embrace it. So one thing that can be really useful along the path is to begin to express from an I feel place. And I know that can be tricky because we look at emotions as labels here, but in order to convey the experience, we can use these particular words, and that keeps us in touch with this internal world, so to speak. And that is the mindfulness aspect. So when communicating with other people, see if you'd be willing to engage in a way that comes from a space of I feel. So for instance, instead of stating just an opinion or keeping all of that energetic aspects of experience in an external way, which you might begin to find is displacing something, start coming from a place of I feel in communication. I feel frustrated, I feel sad. And it's actually probably worthwhile to get into the aspects of emotion. There are tertiary emotions, there are secondary emotions, and there are primary emotions. We really want to stick close to home to the most simple primary emotions in expression, because what that allows us to do is penetrate that particular interpretation and assumption and get directly into sensation, which is really what we want to do when it comes to direct engagement. Yet in communication, because words cannot touch some of these aspects of sensation, we basically stick with what's primary. So we have basically 5 or 6 basic emotions. We have love, we have joy, awe or surprise, we have anger, sadness, and fear. To come from that particular place when communicating, it keeps us closer to what's primary, closer to what's emerging from emptiness. And it also will help basically mitigate any type of conflict. And we'll talk about a particular technique during this video as well. So an example would be, I feel sad when this occurs, in order to essentially communicate that to someone else. And what that essentially does is owning that experience is it displaces that secondary aspect of blaming someone else for our particular experience. Instead, we embrace it, and what that does is that invites that other person to connect, essentially. And as mentioned before, yes, this is a little bit more surface. This is a little bit more kind of pushing into this external world and thought, yet it does ultimately help build a transition in this aspect of awakening. A lot of people will say that they are able to reach a place of samadhi or get really deep into sensation during meditation, yet when stepping away or going to work or interacting with family, friends, or loved ones, they immediately are stepping back into mind identification, and they're not able to see that transition. It feels like a hard line for them. To start using these particular pieces, it will basically make it very clear how these things are arising and what that particular boundary looks like. And once we start to see that boundary is when we begin to examine. It's where we step into a state of curiosity and we begin to see, is there actually a line between this experience of meditation and what seems to be this other experience of mind identification? It can be actually pretty useful along the way. So we move from a space of complete engagement with meditation. We start using certain practices as transition and mindfulness. And basically what that does is that pulls us away from mind identification in our everyday existence, and we then are just fully engaged with what's arising here. That is utilizing the tools and the materials that we know, that we have, in order to build the bridge across this chasm to what we know, to the unknown. So let's talk a little bit about communication. When communicating with another person, oftentimes conflicts arise because we are displacing responsibility. It's a pretty interesting phenomena, actually. And it's all in the name of protection, of course. All these particular identification mechanisms are all about protection. So instead of blaming and pointing the finger, what we do is we come from a place of experience. I feel. And we stick to those 6 primary experiences. I feel angry when you speak to me in a way that appears or seems disrespectful. I feel excited when you tell me about something that we're going to do later, whatever. And I know, obviously, we don't want to be focusing on future events or past events, yet these are probably things that come up every day in experience anyway. So what we're doing is we're pulling away from just this external pressure of experience and pulling it into embracing experience as it's arising here and finding ways to communicate that. Most awakening is very much a personal experience, so to speak, or uniquely relative or temporal in that way. This particular video really is about how that overlaps with what appears to be these other relationships. And yes, this is not the deepest of the depths here, yet it might have some purpose for you. So let's talk about the funnel technique. Basically, the way that looks is it's going to require 2 to tango. And it's an agreement that if a conflict arises, the first thing is if it's escalating too quickly, make an agreement that there's a timeout, cool down period, and then a reconvergence period where we begin to communicate. And it looks something like this. One person gets essentially the floor. They begin to state how they feel based on the circumstances, and then the other person mirrors that back and paraphrases in their own words. And if that's good enough, that paraphrasing, the first person will say yes, and then move on to another point. What this does is it prevents this finger pointing that tends to lead to escalation, that leads to triggering, that leads to often an uncontrollable reaction back and forth between 2 people. And make no mistake, if you look at attachment theory, where there is an avoidant attacher and an aloof attacher, they pretty much are always with someone who's an anxious attacher. And so the person who runs is triggering the person who chases, and the person who's chasing is triggering the person who runs. and then you have that feedback loop. This is about discovering some integration, discovering a sense of harmony, even in our personal and close relationships. And basically this particular technique can work in any kind of relationship. So first example would be something like this. I feel sad when you don't keep your promises. And the other person would say, it upsets you when I don't follow through on the things that I say I'm going to do. And then the first person will say, yes, that's good. And then they will move on to a second point. I feel angry when we have plans and then those suddenly change. And then the second person would say, it's really upsetting and makes you mad that I don't stick to with what I say I'm going to do. Something like that. And then the first person will say yes. Basically, what you want to do is keep it really simple. 3 points each person, paraphrase, and then once the third point is reached, the other person then essentially gets the floor and they funnel. And then they say, I feel scared because it seems like you misunderstand my intentions. And then the second person would say, you feel afraid when it seems like I don't understand you. And then the first person would say yes, so on and so forth. So that's the example. If you can be in a romantic relationship with someone who's willing to basically give this particular method a shot, you will see that particular triggering mechanisms are absolutely bypassed. And that's essentially what we want to do. The only things that are ever worthy of bypassing are the secondary and tertiary experiences. For instance, thoughts can be bypassed, reactions and triggers can be bypassed. All of this, all of awakening is about heading to that which is primary. And yes, as mentioned before, we are coming from a place of vulnerability and also using emotion words and labeling these sensational experiences. Yet, in this objective reality, that's significantly closer than we usually are when we're mind identified. Most of the time, what you'll see in these particular conflicts are people pointing the finger and then people defending, and then you have this topping, escalating conflict that continues to arise. So maybe this might be something worth giving a shot. Use the funnel technique. See if somebody's willing to do that, and we can get into more detail. If you have more questions, you can go ahead and leave those in the comments below. Yet, overall, see if you can also adapt coming from a place of I feel often with expression. This is where we basically transition into becoming absolutely aware all the time of what's going on internally, and then we're not defaulting to some sort of disassociation in this mind conceptual space. So I appreciate everyone watching this video and looking at some of the more surface aspects of awakening and how that can transition into what we would just call everyday life and everyday existence.